Hi all, back to Philosophy 160, Intro to Ethics, and today I'm going to be talking about defenses of utilitarianism. And I've got a picture over here of Mozi over here, famous Chinese philosopher, and you got Mr. Rachels up here, who you read an article by. And so today we're going to be talking about defenses of utilitarianism. Just to remind you, utilitarianism is basically the theory that's giving you a moral code or moral standard saying you should promote maximum aggregate well-being. And that's the thing, that's just the sum total of what underlies the correct moral judgment of what to do and various other things. So uh, Hare gave these three components of utilitarianism. So first of all, it's focused forward on the future state of the world. And it says, look, morality is just a matter of doing the things or having things in place that lead to uh, good future states of the world. And when you're measuring good states of the world, just look at well-being impacts and maximally try to aggregate, get the maximum aggregate increase. And so that's basically the idea. And then they say, look, everybody's well-being matters here. Nobody has well-being that doesn't matter because of their race or religion or anything else, gender. It's all equal. We should measure it all. And it's just, more suffering is worse than less suffering, and more happiness is better than less. Um, and so it's a fairly straightforward theory, and that's one of the appealing things about it. And we had these three objections I talked about last class that some people think there's morally justified forms of unequal treatment. So, and the utilitarians aren't going to go on. They think you have to be very impartial about the way you think about everyone's well-being, count it all equally. The second objection was that it was psychologically unrealistic to demand that we live up to the demands of this really strong, impartial utilitarian theory. And the third objection was that utilitarianism says we should always promote beneficent ends, but sometimes it looks like the only way you can promote the highest level of aggregate well-being is by some unjust means. So remember, we had our sheriff that could give up an innocent man to a mob. Um, and I had you do the little Chino procedure to see how that works out. And so that's another objection. So today I'm going to talk about utilitarian responses. And so this is one of the big things we're going to do in the class is you're going to have different theories. We're going to talk about why people adopt the theories, how the theories work. Then we're talking about objections and then defenses. And what you'll come away from this is you'll have a sense of, why you think a theory is either right or wrong. What kind of reasons can you give? And you might not agree with your classmates or your GTA or me, but we can have a rational debate about this, which is one of the benefits of studying ethics. So our first objection here was that I reconstructed from Freud was if you think of like your family and your friends and people who are close to you, you might think, well, look, if you don't love people as they deserve, that's unjust. And some people deserve more of your love than strangers do. And if you love strangers just as much as the people who deserve more, that's unjust. And that's going to be morally wrong. And since that's what the utilitarian beneficence standard seems to say, it's a defective moral standard. So you've now read the Rachels, and Rachels is someone who's giving a defense of that as an objection to an impartial way of thinking about well-being. Now, as he mentioned, uh, we're thinking about utilitarianism right now, but other moral theories we're going to study in this class, like Kantianism, for example, they also may be quite impartial. So this objection to utilitarianism is worth thinking about now, and no, it'll come back. You'll get other people also trying to convince you that you should be more impartial than maybe you would initially think. So, all right, so the key question here that Rachel's hones in on is, if you're going to argue roughly along the lines Freud did, if that seemed appealing, we have to know why, who are these people who deserve more of your love than strangers, right? So you might have an intuitive list in your mind, like your mom or your dad. You might just be like, who would you favor if you get some money and you can promote some people's well-being? You might not just look at how do I maximally increase well-being in the world. You might be like, well, yeah, but I'm going to kind of help my friends and family first or something, right? So the question is, why are these people in this group, and how do you justify the claim that they deserve more of your love? And so here I've got a quote Mozi saying, whoever criticizes others must have something to replace them. Criticism without suggestion is like trying to stop a flood with a flood or put out fire with fire. So one way to think about what Mozi's on about in this quote I've got is, um, if you're going to criticize utilitarians and you're going to say, Oh, look, we don't like your view because it implies we to be so impartial. We think partiality is good. Okay, well, what you need is you need a positive suggestion about when partiality is justified and why. So why is it that these people deserve special love? And so Rachel's points out you might just do what in philosophy we call a brute appeal to intuition. You might be like, well, it seems to me like my mom deserves special treatment. Okay, so if that's all you've got and you don't have anything more to say, you need to read the part of the paper from Rachel's about intuition, and he says some pretty plausible things that are worrying about that. So if you're just like, well, this is just how it seems to me, it's like, well, lots of things have seemed different to other people. So there have been people who it seemed to them that it was okay to take young babies who, maybe were the wrong gender and just leave them to die on the edge of their city. People have thought lots of things seemed okay to them, and it doesn't seem like a very good rationale. We want to know when are those seemings justified or not. So you could think of other cases where maybe cultural differences will lead you to be a little nervous about appeals to intuition. Um, you might go back to the early discussion at the beginning of the course on cultural relativism, and like some people think slavery is okay, probably you don't. So what we want there is we want to move past these brute differences in intuition and give a set of reasons. The other thing he mentions is that our Darwinian heritage may explain some of our intuitions, and you might doubt that those are a good guide to what really is morally right and wrong. So, but you can make up your own mind, but he's putting pressure on you there to say more. And so now let's look at what Freud said. Freud said someone deserves more love from you if they're so like you in important ways that you can love yourself in him, or if he's so much more perfect than yourself that you can love your ideal of your own self in him. So that could initially seem appealing, like, okay, well, the people I should love more, you know, they're somehow very similar to me, or they're important to me, and they're important to my emotional life. He mentions here with his friend, or if they sort of they look like they represent some ideal that you care about or some set of values you care about. So I think in response to this, Rachel's has sort of two worries about this kind of initial claim. One is, how is this going to rule out people who are going to claim to justify things like racism or sexism? So you can imagine a racist saying, "Oh yeah, I'll help the people who are like me in important ways." Okay, well, what they take to be important ways is, race. Uh, and okay, if they deserve it, if they have sort of, they have sort of excellences that are the ones that they themselves wish they have. Well, maybe some skinhead's going to really like a really horrible neo-Nazi who's really good at, doing mean stuff, horrible things to other people. So the worry about this first suggestion is this way of saying that you're going to justify why it's okay for you to say have priority for your family members that Freud gives. It looks like it's a bad justification because it would also commit you to thinking, say, sexist and racist might be justified in treating, not helping you and helping someone differently. Um, and so that's the worry, is what you want is you want a story about why some people deserve more of your love than others that justifies the cases you think are correct and doesn't overgenerate and justify cases you think are not good forms or that are bad forms of partiality. And so the other thing that he brings up in addition to that, this problem of worrying about the thing you point to might support bad results in other cases, is the idea of luck. And he says, look, just imagine some little kid who's born somewhere and nobody loves them. Yeah, and it's through no fault of their own, right? They're an innocent kid. Why should we be like, oh, okay, I don't need to worry about their well-being. Why? Well, because it sucks for them. They were born in a bad situation. That seems wrong, and it seems like morality should call on us to treat people differently, maybe based on what they've done or the kind of people they are, but not just because of how they happen to have been luckily or unluckily situated in the universe. And so the worry here is if you're just picking people who are close to you, that's just a matter of dumb luck. And so that shouldn't really carry a lot of weight in your moral thinking, or any weight in your moral thinking. So that's another consideration he brings up that you should worry about. And then basically what Rachel's does is he gives you four main ways he can imagine someone giving a relatively good, or trying to give a good justification for why the people they intuitively think deserve special love deserve it, and what these things will be missing when it comes to strangers. So he talks about social roles, proximity to you, the personal goods you have in relationship to this person, and then the need that people have to be treated special by someone. And so what I want you to do is, if you don't have a grip on these different options, you need to go back to the Rachels. We're going to hit pause, and when the think sheet, you need to go to the Rachels, and he's got these laid out. And it's really nice in the article. He's got them headings for each one of these arguments. And so you need to look at, what is the social roles argument? So what's the thing there? What are these social roles? How is someone appealing to those to explain why someone deserves more love? What's the proximity argument? So what's proximity? How would that be thought to justify this? What are personal goods? How would those be used to justify it? What is the need to be treated special? Okay, and then you want to think about which one of those seems most plausible to you as a way to try to justify partiality. Okay, so you want to get your head on each one of these things, what they are. Which one do you seems most plausible? Then what you want to do is you want to ask yourself, what did Rachel say in response to the most plausible one? So that's where you want to go. And I'm going to pause at this point and give you this think sheet. And so what you want to be doing is you want to be looking back at the Rachels, trying to figure out what are those? Do you really understand those 4 different reasons he thinks someone could appeal to say why someone deserves more love than others? And what's his objection to those reasons? Fill out the think sheet that I've got for you to do that, and then we'll come back for the second half of lecture. All right, so I'm assuming you filled out and got some more drill down into what Rachel was saying and his main points there in that article. And so I'm going to go on to the next thing Rachel says about this, which is a thing you may have noticed, depending on which one you picked. There's what you can call utilitarian accommodation of that original argument. And so the basic idea is utilitarians can actually agree that there are some morally justified forms of unequal treatment. So that can seem really confusing at first, because you're like, wait, the utilitarians said we should treat everyone's well-being equally and promote maximum aggregate well-being. Okay, that's true at the most fundamental moral level. So remember, when I talked about here, there's the idea of critical morality, or the critical fundamental moral level, that anything you're going to justify morally has to appeal to producing increased aggregate maximum well-being, where that well-being is all measured impartially. But now here's the thing to look at, and I've got it up here. Institutions or practices of being partial can be justified if they lead to overall maximum aggregate well-being. So the idea here is that the practice of all of us picking one kid or one parent and paying more attention to them than other kids, that might be really good for those people. And if we all stop doing that, we all try to be totally impartial and not treat anyone special, that might make everyone's well-being go down. So the idea is, because we all just randomly pick someone and are nice to them and give them extra love and attention, and we don't give that to all the strangers, all of us doing that as a group, as like a human society, it massively increases the level of well-being that everyone has, the aggregate. So the practice or the institution of being partial can be justified insofar as it leads to overall maximum aggregate well-being. But the key thing to notice about this that Rachel's is really focused on for you is that this could justify a special treatment and love, but not the refusal to share your money and opportunities with strangers. So he thinks you might be able to give this kind of justification for treating people especially, caring more about other people's well-being, things like that. But when it comes to what you're going to do with your money, with opportunities you're going to distribute, he does not think that the practice of being partial is going to be justified by the impact on aggregate well-being at all. So that's the thing you want to notice, is he thinks you can give this kind of by appeal to the distinction between critical and intuitive morality, and talking about the institutions and practices that are a part of intuitive morality, you can defend utilitarianism and accommodate a degree of justified unequal treatment, but not the degree that most people originally think. Okay, so that's the second thing. Notice the other thing is, now when Rachel's, here's what he says, when the matter is viewed from this perspective, it turns out the partialists and impartialists, they aren't really making conflicting claims. The partialist point concerns the nature of the attitudes and motivations that people have in these little social institutions. But the impartialist is concerned, how do you justify that? How do you know that this is a morally good way for us all to act? And he thinks, look, it's the impartialists. The great thing about them, about this utilitarian view, for example, is that they can explain why certain patterns of us all treating each other in a special way are morally good. They've got the justification. It promotes aggregate well-being. So he says there's a respect in which impartialism is actually the better view, because the impartialist then can also regard a total social system as lacking if all children and not just the lucky ones are not provided for. So here's the other thing is utilitarians going to say, look, and we need, if our current institutions are just leaving some kids out to dry through bad luck, that's really morally bad. So they're insisting we think about everyone's the aggregate well-being, and that includes even the unlucky kids. So he thinks so the utilitarians can accommodate to some degree partiality, and they give you a really good justification for it, and then they give you a reason to critique our social systems if they're leaving some kids out just due to bad luck. And he doesn't really think that necessarily you're going to be able to justify that on other grounds. So that's going to be one way utilitarians will answer some of these objections, is accommodating them to some degree and then arguing they have a better account of why it's justified to the extent it is. Okay. So our second objection was that the utilitarian theory was psychologically unrealistic. It was too demanding. And I gave you a spiel about this, an argument. If it's morally wrong to do something, it's fair to blame someone for doing it. If it's fair to blame someone, then they could have done otherwise. And if it's morally wrong to do something, then the person could have done otherwise. But the utilitarian standard says things are wrong, but people couldn't have done better. And so here Freud had the idea like, look, utilitarianism says you're supposed to, like, think about Singer's argument. You're supposed to give up so much to help people that are in need, locally or far away. And who's going to live that way, right? You might be like, first of all, you might just think, I'm not going to do that. But then you might also think, even if I try, nobody could live like that. That's not realistic. So the standard is defective. Okay, well, here, one thing you want to do is look at, Rachel's has some really nice stuff in his paper about the value of utopian thinking. And again, he wants to distinguish critical fundamental moral principles from the kind of applied principles you should use in ethical deliberation in the real world. So he thinks if we're trying to think about morality, we should really be trying to think about how should we want the world to be? What would be the best way for it to be? And he thinks the utilitarians are right. And he thinks it's important to have that kind of utopian story where we can critique our defective way things are going now. Now, when you ask yourself a question, given the way the world is, what's the most reasonable thing to do? That's a set of applied ethical questions. So if you haven't looked at it in the last section of the paper, he gets into that for the case of children. The other thing I want to mention is this ought implies fan principle that's behind this. That was rejected by some thinkers. And we'll be talking about this. I've got Martin Luther up here, famous Protestant. He rejected the principle of ought implies can. So he said ought doesn't imply can. And here's what he thought would say about this, about the kind of argument I had up here, that first you should distinguish appropriate self-assessment from appropriate blame by other people. So he would say, look, it's important. The theory might tell you something is morally wrong, and maybe you should feel bad about that. You're doing something morally subpar. That doesn't necessarily mean it's appropriate for other people to blame you. So that was one of the things I had in this original argument, and we'll get into this more when we talk about Kant. But some people think if something's morally required of you, then it has to be something you could do or psychologically get yourself to do, physically be capable of doing. Luther's pushing back against that, and part of it had to do with his beliefs about providence and inherited sin and things like that. But the general point is, some people will push back against that, and they'll say, no, look, it's maybe there's something you can't really do better, but it's good for you to know that you have this moral defect. It increases your self-knowledge. You're more honest with yourself about who you are and what you're like, and so you could think about either this kind of Luther way of saying that it's okay and it's true that there are things that are morally wrong, even though nobody can really blame you for doing them, but maybe you should just feel bad about them or be aware of these defects you have. And then there was also Rachel's line about the value of utopian thinking. And again, he's also emphasizing this is really for a kind of critical, deep knowledge of morality, not necessarily you have to separate that from what should go on at the intuitive level. So that's the response to the psychologically demandingist objection. Our last objection was that beneficent ends don't really justify unjust means, but that's kind of what the utilitarians are stuck saying. So we had our example, should the sheriff execute an innocent man to prevent a riot where this mob is going to go and kill a bunch more people? So the well-being impact in aggregate would be much worse if the rioters went out. So it looks like utilitarianism is going to say, oh, the sheriff should execute the innocent man. So I wanted to go back to Hare, and he'll give you the utilitarian response to this. So he says, there are lots of well-worn examples. Okay, the alleged requirement of utilitarianism that the sheriff should execute an innocent man to prevent a riot. So that's the one I've told you about already. There are other ones. You could save an important person from an air crash rather than your own son if you can't save both. So say that important person is going to do much more good in the world than your son. Isn't that going to maximally produce an increase in well-being in aggregate? You should break promises when even the slightest advantage and is going to be produced, or you should kidnap one person, kill him, and extract his organs in order to save the lives of many other people. So these are all examples of things that look like unjust means that utilitarianism would recommend in order to promote the beneficent end, the most accurate well-being. Okay, Hare's response. These are all easily answered once we realize the importance for moral practice of having firm principles or rules that we do not readily depart from. We can't often predict the future well enough. So that's the first thing he says. And he says, even if you do, you often don't have time to fully consider without bias the facts of the case. And he thinks we need these general ground rules as a base of general convictions and intuitions that it's unwise to depart from lightly. And we know we'll often be in danger of not acting for the best. So again, this is his idea that at an intuitive level, when you're kind of dealing with like the messy conditions of life, where you've got biases going on in your psychology and you're under pressure of time and you have many motives going on in your mind, maybe we shouldn't get into trying to these kinds of cases. And so just imagine the psychological pressure of being the sheriff. Is he going to be thinking clearly? Can he really estimate the outcomes of the riot or not? How does he know what's going to happen? It's very hard. And so Hare says, look, what we should have is just a set of firm principles, like telling us what to do, and just stick with those. Don't get into this thing of trying in these complicated, especially hot, pressured environments, trying to kind of do the calculus using the CHIMA procedure. The CHIMA procedure is a model for understanding ultimately what it would be the best outcome overall, right? For critical morality, in our moments of calm reflection, when we're thinking about, principles to adopt for our life or which institutions are the best in our society. When you're in the kind of the buzzing craziness of daily life, you want to go with a set of rules and not get into that sort of calculation stuff. And here's what Hare says. Look, we found that in most real cases, such as we might encounter in practice, they're not as difficult to handle as the cases the philosophers are going to give us. So think of the example I gave you from Ursula Le Guin, really far out sci-fi case, right? And he says, look, usually in real cases, they're going to be much more complex than the ones the philosophers give you, and the additional information will help you to reconcile your intuitions with utilitarianism. For example, the abandonment of the rule forbidding murder will inevitably have evil consequences that no saving of a patient's life by giving them murdered people's organs will compensate for. The murders will not remain secret, and there will be better ways of securing organ transplant. Okay. Now here's the case that you've thought a little bit about. The sheriff will do well to think what will happen in real life if sheriffs do not maintain the rule of law of justice and preserve people's life. So what's going to go on in the real world? If this guy does this to this mob, it's probably going to lead to now there's just going to be mobs all over the place that are like, oh, dude, we can just get these cops to do whatever we want. It's going to lead to all kinds of more riots, lots of lawlessness, disrespect for the law, all kinds of bad consequences. Plus, that guy is probably going to get brought up on charges. And so that's the kind of thinking that the Hare says, if you start thinking about the real world cases, these one-off, I'm going to depart from the rules and do the unjust thing to bring the best, most beneficent end out. It's just not really realistic. He thinks that in the real world, you don't get into these cases like that. And when you think maybe you're in that case, you're probably in a kind of situation where you shouldn't be trusting your intuitive judgments because it might be biased. And so you should just go with the general rules. And the general rules are you don't turn in the innocent in order to placate mobs. That's as a rule, that's a good rule because people acting on it and sheriffs acting on it, it tends to promote aggregate well-being. So that's Hare's response to this objection. And we'll be coming back to this after the next unit. We're going to be turning, starting next class, to questions about the nature of the good life. And so we've been talking about beneficence. We want to know, what are you trying to promote when you're promoting accurate well-being? What is well-being? What is a good life? That's what we're talking about. Then we'll come back a little bit later in the course to slavery and this is this response I'm just talking about here from here about injustice, is it satisfying? And we'll see they're going to be deontologists, a different type of moral theory. They're not going to accept these responses, these defenses of utilitarianism, and they're going to give you then, like Mozart says they would need to, an actual alternative theory that you might choose instead of utilitarianism. So, but that's it for now. And if you want to look at the last part of your think sheet, I've got, if you can, try to summarize which one of these objections is still most worrisome for you when it comes to utilitarianism, and why aren't you satisfied with the responses you've encountered so far. And that's something you might bring up in section 2 if you're not really clear. How are these responses working? Do you buy them or not? So that's it for today, and I will talk to you all soon.